It's so great to be back with you, my holy sisters and brothers. I missed you, but we had a beautiful Shabbos and Shavuos, a 3-day Chag, as it were, and some learning that even went late into last night, so I'm so glad we didn't schedule a class for the conclusion of Shavuos last night. I wouldn't have made it. And here we are. It's Tuesday. And so we're going to cover 4 pages today, the highlights of 4 pages, so that we're caught up. Let's light up the darkness. That was Baruch Chait singing his song Motzi from the album The Jerusalem Echoes. How's everybody doing who's with us on a Tuesday? Pauline in Chicagoland, Renee in Indiana, Nancy in North Carolina, Rose in New Mexico, Melanie in Arkansas, Bella in Florida, and I'm so glad you're here. You dedicated today's episode. Sharon in New Jersey, Lucy in Minnesota, Paula in Chicago, Karen in Northern California, Bill in mid-Missouri. Paula says shalom and welcome. Happy you are back. Thank you so much. Barbara in Central Arkansas. Sherry in Pennsylvania. And over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas. Aoife in Florida. Marjorie in Georgia. Welcome, everybody. Today's episode of AT Daily sponsored by Bella Rubin in honor of Rabbi Shalom Schmerling's birthday, which falls on Shavuos. As emissaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Shalom and Rebbetzin Chaya Rivka built a thriving Jewish community in Venice and Northport in Florida. Happy birthday, Rabbi Shalom, and many happy and healthy returns to 120. Thank you for your incredible work and commitment to bringing Jewish learning into so many lives. What a beautiful dedication, Bella. May the rabbi and the Rebbetzin and all their family be showered in blessings. May you and all your family be showered in blessings. And we say amen. And thank you for enabling us to share more Torah with more people around the world by sponsoring this episode of AT Daily. If anybody else would like to sponsor an episode, go to accidentaltalmudist.org, follow the donate button, and put the dedication in when you make the donation. Okay, so we are in chapter 10 of Tractate Yevamos, the 14th volume of the Talmud, generally speaking, the laws of Yibum. And as we've seen, we've had many general laws about marriage, about prohibited marriage, about marriage with priests, and all the special circumstances that involves, the nuances and implications and impacts of prohibited marriages, partially prohibited marriages. Here in chapter 10, we're dealing with this very, very dramatic and difficult and tragic situation where particularly this applied in the ancient world where news was really hard to come by about your loved ones across the ocean, that a woman was married, her husband went on a journey, disappeared, a witness or 2 witnesses, and those are 2 different cases, came and testified that the man was dead. Her husband died. She mourned, she grieved, she decided to move on with her life, and she got married again. And then the husband, supposedly dead, shows up, returns to the country, returns to her, and now it's an awful situation because strictly speaking, this is a married woman with a living husband who went and, thought she was marrying another guy, but that marriage couldn't be legitimate, could it? And therefore she had sexual relations with a man not her husband. That's adultery. She at that point becomes prohibited to her first husband. And if she had children with the second husband, those children are mamzers. A terrible, terrible state of affairs. But the sages did draw a fascinating distinction that we saw in the first Mishna here in chapter 10, that if 2 witnesses came, which is the proper way, right? So if 2 witnesses said that man was dead, okay, then she was correct to rely on their testimony, and she did nothing wrong by marrying the second guy. It was considered like something that was done unwitting or even under duress. She can return to the first husband. And I'm pretty sure even the children of the second union would not be considered mamzers because of the special circumstances. However, if there was only one witness, now normally by the testimony of one witness, we can't do anything because 2 witnesses are required. But we don't want this woman to be stuck as an aguna, a woman awaiting her husband who never comes home for the rest of her life. So if there was one witness, we're going to allow her to remarry, but only because she gets a special ruling from the court. If the guy shows up after that, she bears the risk of that. And she's going to have to divorce the second husband and divorce the first husband. She's prohibited to both of them. If there's children from the second union, they're mamzers. If she goes back with the first husband and has another child with him, that's a mamzer also. Terrible, terrible outcome. The policy outcome of that is the women will be very, 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 very careful and patient and really wait a long time and make sure this guy isn't coming back from the dead, as it were, before she remarries, if she's going to rely on the testimony of one witness. And the fact that she got a ruling from the court doesn't shield her from that. If there were 2 witnesses, she doesn't need a ruling from the court. Then she acted properly. If there's only one witness, we prefer she doesn't remarry, but we'll let her, but she's undertaking a risk. That's where we've come. That's where the sages came out on this question. And now we pick up this discussion on page 88b, where we left off on Friday. Now, this situation could happen where there's a priest involved also. So Rava raised an objection from a baraisa. From where is it derived that if a priest does not want to observe the strictures against disqualified women? So we're actually kind of went off into a little digression in the midst of this conversation where, because, if she married that second husband on the testimony of one witness, we're going to make them split up. And on the subject of forcing a couple that believe they married properly, but they didn't, and are we going to step in and force them to get a divorce? If the case involves a priest, generally speaking, the court is going to be quicker to force the divorce, as it were, and that's what's under discussion here. So from where is it derived that if a priest does not want to observe the strictures against disqualified women, right? So if a priest married a divorcee, he's not allowed to do that. But if he did it anyway, he's disqualified from serving as a priest. But are we going to force him to divorce? Isn't it enough that he can no longer serve as a priest? Is the court actually going to step in and force this guy to get a divorce? And so if a priest does not want to observe the strictures against disqualified women, then the court forces him by flogging him, and it sanctifies him despite his wishes. How do we know that this is the law? Because the verse states, Leviticus 21:8, at the end of the chapter, that deals with the prohibitions of the priesthood, and you, meaning the court, meaning the elders, and you shall sanctify him. He shall be sacred for you, which indicates that this is performed even against his will. So where we see that perhaps a non-priest, we don't force a divorce, but because priests are held to this much higher standard where they don't enter cemeteries, they don't become impure for anyone but the very closest of relatives, or a corpse that has no one to bury it, and then all kinds of other ways we keep them separate, we keep them at a higher level of purity. So maybe it's for a priest we'll force a divorce, but perhaps for a non-priest we don't. Now, Rava analyzes this baraisa. What are the circumstances? Assuming that this is referring to a priest who married a woman whose status as a divorced woman or a zona, a woman who had illicit sexual relations and therefore becomes prohibited to marry any priest. So what if the status of that woman as a divorced woman or a zona is uncertain? Okay, we understand that if for sure he married a divorcee, the court is going to step in and force them to divorce. What if he married a possible divorcee, right? Perhaps because maybe her original betrothal to some guy, which led to a divorce, was never a valid betrothal to begin with, and we gave her a certificate of divorce just to be sure, but maybe she didn't really need it, so she's an uncertain divorcee. Can a priest marry her? No. If he does, do we force the divorce the way we would for a certain divorcee in the case of an uncertain divorcee? If we say that she did not marry, what are the circumstances? Assuming that this is referring to a priest who married a woman whose status as a divorced woman or a zona is uncertain. So if we say that she did not marry one of her witnesses, right? So now we're back to our case of the Mishna, right? That this woman, her husband went away on a journey, didn't come back. Witnesses came forward and said, we saw that he died. Okay, 2 witnesses. She acted properly if she remarries. What if the guy she marries is one of the witnesses? Problematic, right? Because if at the time that he gave the witness testimony, he wasn't conceiving that he would end up married to this woman, okay, seems like no problem. But if he was thinking, if her husband's dead, I can marry her, and he has a vested interest in giving that witness testimony, seems a little problematic. So if we say that she did not marry one of her witnesses, and she did not say, it is clear to me that the opposing witnesses were speaking the truth. Now, we got into a case that was coming up at the end of our last session where, 2 witnesses came and said, your husband died. Now she can remarry. But then either before she remarries or after she remarries, and those are 2 different cases, a second set of witnesses comes and says, no, the first witnesses are wrong. That man is alive. We saw him alive. Huge problem, right? Because we believe 2 witnesses over 1 witness. But when we have 2 witnesses versus 2 witnesses, it's a problem, right? So that now it's uncertain what's really going on. It's sort of 50-50 with the witnesses. So if that second set of witnesses comes before she remarries, we don't allow her to remarry. If that second set of witnesses comes after she remarries, we don't force her to divorce. But what if it's a priest? Problematic, right? So so if this case where we're possibly going to force the priest to divorce the uncertain divorcee, and we're asking, what is the case? Well, if it's that she did not marry one of her witnesses, and she did not say, it is clear to me that the opposing witnesses were speaking the truth, need this be said, that the court forces him? Since both of them are clearly in violation of a transgression, it is obvious that they must be separated. Rather, is it not referring to a case when she married one of her witnesses, and she says, it is clear to me, and even so the Baraisa is teaching that the court forces him? Apparently the law is that they remove her from him, which contradicts Rav's opinion that one who married based on the testimony of 2 witnesses need not leave her second husband. And the Gemara answers, a prohibition with regard to the priesthood is different, as uncertainties with regard to priests are treated stringently, as though they were definite. And if you wish, say a different way. What is the meaning of the phrase, the court forces him? It means that it forces him by witnesses. In other words, only if another pair of witnesses comes and clarifies the matter does the court prevent the marriage ab initio. However, if she has already married, she need not leave her husband. And if you wish, say instead that it is referring to a situation when witnesses came and afterwards she married, and this Baraisa, which claims that the court forces him to divorce her in that case, is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Menachem, the son of Rabbi Yosef. Now, Rav Ashi said, what is the meaning of the phrase, she need not leave him, that Rav said? It means that she need not leave the state of being permitted to her first husband. Since she married according to law, on the basis of witness testimony, she is considered to have acted under duress, and like any other woman not married to a priest who was unfaithful against her will, she may return to her first husband when he shows up, right? We really don't want that outcome where she's going to be prohibited to both of them. If the first husband comes back and we see that the witnesses were wrong, but she relied on the testimony of 2 witnesses when she remarried, okay, so we don't want her to be so penalized that she ends up married to no one. we want her to, she was never unmarried to her husband. She just thought he was dead. So now she returns to him. And what happened with the second husband was accidental. So she didn't marry him. And she just returns to her first husband. Now they might, I think they do, force that second husband to give her a bill of divorce. It's a little strange because they were never really married. Since it turns out that the first husband never died, the marriage to the second husband was never real, was never actual. Why would she need a bill of divorce? Just for the public policy aspect of it, that people shouldn't think that she returns from, that she leaves this marriage to the second guy without a bill of divorce. Now, that's problematic too, because you cannot marry your wife that you divorced if she goes and marries another guy in the meantime. She will always be prohibited to you. So do we want people to think that, well, what happened here was she left the first husband, married a second guy, divorced the second guy, and went back to the first guy? It's only this very strange particular circumstances that they thought he was dead. According to proper testimony of two witnesses that she went and married the second guy. Then the first husband showed up again. She's going to return to him in that case. She will get a bill of divorce, and that's the best we can do, as it were. All right, we skip forward a little bit. We are on page 88b near the end. The Mishnah teaches that if she remarried as the result of an error, then when her first husband returns, she requires a bill of divorce from this one and from that one. Now that's in the case where she's not going to be allowed to return to the first husband. Why? Because she relied on the testimony of one witness, right? In that case, she took a risk. And if the first husband shows up again, she's going to be prohibited to both the first husband and the second husband. And she's going to need a bill of divorce from both of them. And the Gemara asks, well, granted, from the first husband, she requires a bill of divorce as she is his actual wife. But from the second husband, why does she need a bill of divorce? Surely their relationship is merely licentious. That's why she's going to become prohibited to both of them. Since her first husband was alive at the time, her marriage to the second is entirely invalid, as one cannot betroth a married woman. A woman does not require a bill of divorce for engaging in sexual relations. She doesn't require a bill of divorce for an invalid betrothal. Rav Huna said it is a rabbinic decree. This bill of divorce is required by rabbinic decree rather than Torah law. Why? Lest those who are unaware of the whole story say that this first husband divorced her and afterward the second one married her. And if she subsequently leaves him without a full bill of divorce, they will claim that we find a married woman leaving her husband without a bill of divorce. Remember, this poor woman is going to be prohibited to her first husband and she's going to be prohibited to her second husband. But with a bill of divorce from both of them, she is permitted to find a third husband. She's permitted to every other Jewish man in the world, as long as there's not some other prohibition involved. But if she doesn't get that bill of divorce from the first husband, certainly, and in this case by rabbinic decree from the second husband as well, she doesn't become permitted to other men. She can't go and get married and find, her husband for the rest of her life from a third guy. So that's why they're going to require that bill of divorce from both of them. From the so Rav Huna said, it is a rabbinic decree lest those who are unaware of the entire story say that this first husband divorced her and afterward this second man married her. And if she subsequently leaves him without a bill of divorce, they will claim that we find a married woman leaving her husband without a bill of divorce. And the Gemara asks, if so, consider the latter clause of the Mishnah on page 92a that teaches that if they said to her, your husband is dead, and she became betrothed to another, and afterward her husband came, it is permitted for her to return to her first husband. There too, let us say that people might think that this one divorced her and that one betrothed her, and that we find a married woman leaving her husband, i.e. the second husband, without a bill of divorce. And the Gemara answers, yeah, that's not the same. Actually, even if she was merely betrothed, she requires a bill of divorce from the second man before she can return to the first husband. And the Gemara raises a difficulty. If so, people will say that we find this one remarrying his divorcee after she was betrothed to another. And the Gemara answers, in this regard, the Tana holds in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef ben Kefar, who stated a principle with regard to a divorcee who formed a relationship with another man, that if she came from marriage, it is prohibited for her to return to her first husband, but if she came from betrothal, it is permitted. Meaning, if she became, in a regular case of divorce, a man divorces his wife, she goes and becomes betrothed to a second guy. They never get fully married. They never consummate the betrothal. They never have sex. In that case, she can return to her first husband and he can remarry her. But if she had sex with the second husband, betrothal is like marriage. Once you enter betrothal, you need a bill of divorce. But if you never had sex, then even though you need a bill of divorce to leave that betrothal, she still remains permitted to the first husband. We're on 89a, near the top, and the Mishna taught that this woman does not have, i.e. she is not entitled to the payment of her marriage contract, right? This poor woman who relied on the witness of one witness, the woman who relied on the testimony of one witness in order to remarry, and then the husband shows up again. So she is going to be prohibited to both her first husband and her second husband. They both have to divorce her. And not only that, she doesn't get paid the ketubah, right? She doesn't get paid the ketubah or kasuba, same word. In other words, what is a kasuba? That was the marriage contract which obligated a man to pay his wife a substantial amount of money if he's going to divorce her. Now, that was a protection for the woman in a very patriarchal ancient society where only the man had the unilateral power to divorce. He could divorce her whenever he wants. She cannot divorce him. In that system, in that society, the sages said, okay, well, if you're going to, if you have the option to divorce her, it's going to be costly for you. You're not going to do that quickly or lightly. It's not like you just had a fight and then decide to divorce her, because if you divorce her, you have a very heavy monetary penalty that you have to pay her, what to live off after she's on her own and without your support. In this case, where she's getting penalized for not waiting and relying on the testimony of one witness, when she remarried and the first husband shows up again, they both divorce her, and there is no kasuba payment. It's a further penalty. And why do they do it? Because they want to make it easy for the first husband to divorce her. They want that divorce to happen. They don't want to have to step in and flog him to make it happen. That's the law, and they should follow it. Tragic situation. Skip a couple paragraphs. The Mishnah taught that the child of either of the men is a mamzer, right? This is where she only relied on one witness, married a second time, first husband shows up, she has to divorce both of them. If she had a child by the second husband, then that was an illegitimate marriage, and that child is a mamzer. When the first husband comes back and she returns to him, and then they have a child, that child is a mamzer because she was prohibited to him. If they had a child before the guy went away, that child is not a mamzer because that was the child of a legitimate union at that time. So the Mishnah taught that the child of either man is a mamzer. And to clarify this issue, the Gemara cites a different discussion. So they're gonna bring in the cases of teruma, consecrated food, and cases where by rabbinic decree the sages are going to penalize one who did not separate teruma properly, and they're going to use that as an analogy for what happens here, where we're penalizing both her and the children of these unions, because she didn't wait when the husband seemed to be dead and only one witness came forward. So the Mishnah taught that the child of either of the men is a mamzer, and to clarify this, the Gemara cites a different discussion. We learned in a Mishnah elsewhere, Terumot 2:2, one may not separate teruma, food consecrated that only priests can eat, from ritually impure produce in order to exempt ritually pure food. Right? So think about that. You're a farmer. You have the produce of your field. The first 2% you separate, and you have to give it to a kohen. You have to give it to a priest. The priest can only eat that teruma if the teruma is tahor, the teruma is in a state of ritual purity, and the priest himself is tahor, ritually pure. Then he can eat the teruma. This guy who harvested his field, he has to hand over 2% of his crop. Now, what if, part of his crop, he has it in a bunch of piles of grain, and somehow one of the piles of grain became impure because like a dead mouse fell into it and they found it. So that pile is impure. Can he take 2% of his crop measured from the impure pile? If he did it on purpose, it's like he did nothing at all. He hasn't removed the teruma, and therefore all of the grain remains untied, and none of it can be eaten by Jewish law. What if he separated the teruma with good intent to give the finest first 2% of his crop in a state of purity to the priest, and he handed it over to the priest, and only later found out that without his knowledge, it was tameh, it was ritually impure when he separated that teruma. Did his separation of teruma count, right? Is it valid? Was the teruma? The priest can't eat that teruma, but it is his possession, so he can benefit from it. A priest cannot eat food in a state of ritual impurity, but a non-priest can. So it's possible that the priest with this impure teruma can sell it. It's his property. Just like we saw, he can't eat impure olive oil that was given to him as teruma, but he can burn it and benefit from its light. Likewise, I think he can sell impure teruma for someone else to eat that's not restricted in that way. Okay, so what is the outcome in this situation? One may not separate teruma from ritually impure produce in order to exempt ritually pure food. And if he separated teruma from impure food unwittingly, his teruma is considered teruma. Now that's like the woman who relied on the testimony of 2 witnesses that her husband died, and then she went and remarried. Right? And then the guy shows up again. There we don't penalize her. She's going to have to leave the second husband because now her first husband is back, but we don't make the children mamzers. We don't make her prohibited to both men. Her kasuva is back in force with her first husband, etc. We don't apply those penalties. And it's similar to this person who separated impure teruma mistakenly. If he acted intentionally, if he knew that he was separating, or if he willingly risked separating teruma that might well be impure, that which is the same as intentional in this case, then we penalize him, and his separation of teruma is as if he did nothing at all. What he separated remains teruma, actually. He's going to lose the benefit of that, but he has to separate another 2% in order to consider his produce tithed. Okay, now we skip forward a bit. We're on page 89b. Rav Chisda said to Rabbah, "And do you not hold that the sages have the power to do so, to make decrees that will uproot Torah law?" Right? So it's, in other words, we find cases where by Torah law something is permitted, but by rabbinic law it is prohibited, or vice versa. And now the sages are checking whether in these situations, do the sages really have the power in order to draw a fence around the Torah and keep people from coming to violate prohibitions, that they're going to add other laws. That's what rabbinic decrees are. And sometimes it even happens that a rabbinic decree will create a different outcome than a Torah law. So Rav Chisda said to Rabbah, "And do you not hold that the sages have the power to do so? But didn't we learn in the Mishna that the child is a mamzer from this one and from that one?" Now granted, the child from the second man is a mamzer, as he was born to a married woman from a man who was not her husband. However, with regard to the child from the first husband, now this is not a child that she had with her first husband before he went on that long journey where he disappeared, but rather, he disappeared. She, on the testimony of one witness, married another guy, okay? And then they had a kid, and then the first husband comes back. Now, before they checked with any rabbis what they're supposed to do, she says, okay, well, my first husband's back. I'm sorry. I have to go back with him. Now, in that case, the child of the second husband is a mamzer because her husband never died, and we understand she had sex with a guy who's not her husband, so that the child of that union is a mamzer. Tragic case, happened accidentally. What about now she returns to the first husband and they have another kid? This is her husband. He was always her husband. Why would the child that she has when she returns to her first husband be a mamzer? It's only because the sages have said she's prohibited to both of these men as a penalty for relying on the testimony of a single witness when she remarried. But if so, then this child, the child of the second session, as it were, of her marriage to the first husband, is really a mamzer by rabbinic decree because he's her husband. He was always her husband, and now she had a child with her husband. How could it be a mamzer? However, with regard to the child from the first husband, why is he a mamzer? After all, she is his wife, and by Torah law, their son is a full-fledged Jew. He's not a mamzer. He can marry any Jew. And the sage's declaration that he is a mamzer cannot be seen as a mere stringency, as they thereby permit him to a mamzeres, right? The one person that a mamzer can't marry a Jew, right? A mamzer is a male offspring of a prohibited union, right? Like a Jewish woman who had an affair with a Jewish man, not her husband, got pregnant, had a child, and it's a boy. This boy is a mamzer. He can't marry any Jewish woman, but he can marry a Jewish female who is like him, the offspring of a prohibited union. So when they declare that this child that this poor woman had with her first husband after he returned is a mamzer, right? It's a stringency, like they don't want, it's a punishment basically because she relied on the testimony of a single witness to move forward. But it's not just a stringency because now they render this boy, the mamzer, permitted to a mamzeres, to a female mamzer, which otherwise he would not have been. And this shows that a rabbinical decree can actually uproot a Torah prohibition. Rabbah said to Rav Chisda that Shmuel said like this: it is forbidden for the child of the first husband to marry a mamzeret. We're going to consider him a mamzer, but he can't even marry a female mamzer. And similarly, when Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael, he said that Rabbi Yochanan said the child is forbidden to a mamzeres. And if so, why does the Mishna call him a mamzer? This is to teach that the sages are stringent and they render it prohibited for him to marry a regular Jewish woman. And with regard to the issue at hand, as he may not marry a mamzeres, the sages did not, in fact, uproot a mitzvah that applies by Torah law. They just created a stringency, which is a full-on, red light warning. Don't remarry when you don't have two witnesses testifying that your husband died. Do anything you can to get that kind of a testimony to protect yourself in the future. What is the law? If a man went overseas and his wife married another man under the mistaken impression that he was dead, and her first husband returned and had relations with her before she received a bill of divorce from the second man, then the sages decreed that their child is a mamzer. Since he is not a mamzer by Torah law, it is forbidden for him to wed a mamzeres. He may marry only a woman who, like him, is forbidden by rabbinic law. Right? Very special case, very limited. But at least there's some kind of an out. And interesting that when they finally decided the halacha, they didn't render, when she goes back to the first husband and has a baby with him, that's a mamzer unless she didn't get a bill of divorce from the second husband. So that could also apply where there was testimony of two witnesses. But let's continue. All right, we go to page 90A and about halfway down the page. Come in here, a different proof. with regard to blood that became ritually impure. So they're going to do another kind of analogy, which is going to eventually teach us something that we can take back to the case of this mistaken marriage. So, with regard to blood that became ritually impure and a priest sprinkled it on the altar. We're talking about the temple is standing. People are bringing korbanos. People are bringing offerings to the temple. Sin offerings, burnt offerings, guilt offerings, etc. So whatever the particular offering that we're talking about, in order for the person, let's say it's a sin offering, so in order for the person to effect his atonement or her atonement for having sin offerings are brought because you unwittingly committed a transgression, the punishment of which for doing it intentionally is charis, death at the hands of the heavenly court, but you did it unwittingly. Okay, so you bring a sin offering to the temple, and part of the procedure of the sin offering is that after the animal is slaughtered, the priests in the temple receive some of its blood in a special vessel and then sprinkle some of that blood on the altar itself. That whole process has to be done with an animal that's tahor in a state of ritual purity, and that the blood that's received from the animal must stay in a state of ritual purity until it's sprinkled on the altar. How would it become impure? Because a priest made a mistake and he himself became impure. He came into contact with some source of impurity, and then he touched the vessel holding the blood, and now that blood is impure. Okay, so what happens in that situation? So blood that became ritually impure, and a priest sprinkled it on the altar, we have a distinction that applies. If the priest did so unwittingly, so then the offering is accepted. But if he sprinkled the blood intentionally, knowing that it had become impure, then this whole offering is invalidated, and the person who brought the sin offering does not receive the atonement for which he brought the sin offering. And here it is a case where, by Torah law, the blood affects acceptance, as it is taught in a baraisa. For what does the tzitz affect acceptance? Right? The high priest wore the tzitz, the gold front plate across the forehead of the high priest serving in the temple, which says, holy to God. And there was a special power associated with that golden front piece, namely that it would affect acceptance of offerings that were brought in a state of impurity. It was a kind of beautiful catch-all purification device to protect people who brought sin offerings and through no fault of their own, while the priests were bringing their offering for them up to the altar, somehow they came into contact with impurity. So then the tzitz makes it so that it's as if it was offered in a state of purity, and the person who brought the sin offering receives the atonement. But now the sages are going to say, yeah, but you know what? If the priest knew that he was sprinkling with blood that had become impure, then the tzitz is not going to affect acceptance of that sprinkling. So for what does the high priest front plate affect acceptance? For blood, for meat, and for fat that became impure, whether unwittingly or intentionally, whether by unavoidable accident or willingly, whether in the case of an individual offering or an offering of the community. So it seems like the guy who brought the offering, he's covered. He's good. Even if the priest made a mistake and then decided he didn't want to share that he made a mistake with anybody else around him, and so knowingly he brought that impure blood up to the altar and sprinkled with it, the guy who owned the sin offering handed it over to the priest, he's covered. According to what the Torah law is, the tzitz of the high priest affects acceptance for that, even if it was brought knowingly in a state of impurity. But the sages said that if a priest sprinkled impure blood intentionally, the front plate does not affect acceptance, and its owner must bring another offering. And the Gemara infers, since he is not obligated to bring this extra offering by Torah law, in essence, he subsequently brings in a non-sacred animal to the courtyard. right? So the sages have created a situation where in order to, complete the process of bringing a sin offering, this guy has to bring a new offering. Why are the sages stepping in and doing that? Seems onerous. Must be that if they didn't do that, there would be too many priests bringing impure offerings. Or some other matter of law that when we look at the Torah law more closely, we'll see that the Torah made that opening and created a necessity the sages rule this way. They're not going to do it just to be stringent for no reason. They had a reason. Right now, we're not going into what the reasons were for that. It's just this is the way the situation is. So Rabbi Yosef Bar Chanina said that there's no proof from here. As what is the meaning of the phrase does not affect acceptance that the Tana of the Baraisa said? It means that it does not affect acceptance in the sense that it permits the meat of the offering to be eaten. However, the owners themselves do attain atonement through it. It's not that this person has to bring another offering and that he didn't get his sin offering accepted. You're misunderstanding the whole situation. Rather, because he brought a sin offering and the priests brought the blood knowing that it was in a state of impurity to the altar, the tzitz will affect acceptance for the guy who brought the sin offering to the temple, but the portion of the animal, and all sin offerings, a portion of that animal, the meat of that animal, a portion of it, goes to the priests as part of their payment for working in the temple, and they eat it, right? But here, because the priest brought some of that blood, knowing that it was in a state of impurity, he cannot eat, and his brother priests cannot eat the meat, the priestly portion of that sin offering. Now that makes good sense. So the Gemara raises a difficulty. Ultimately, the Torah mitzvah of eating the meat of this offering is uprooted, right? At least it does seem that, okay, now you're making more sense, but the bottom line is the tzitz was supposed to affect acceptance not only of the blood and therefore the sin offering on behalf of the person who brought the sin offering, but also that it would affect acceptance so that the priestly portion of the sin offering could be eaten by the priest, even if the procedure was marred by the fact that when the blood was brought to the altar, it became impure and the priest who sprinkled it there knew it became impure. And now the sages are saying, no, if he knew it became impure, you're not going to be allowed to eat the meat, even though it would seem that by Torah law, that tzitz would affect acceptance, and you could eat the meat. So ultimately, the Torah mitzvah of eating the meat of this offering is uprooted. And it is written, and they shall eat those things with which atonement was made. Exodus 29:33. And this verse teaches that the priests eat the offering, and the owner thereby gains atonement when they eat the offering. And he said to them, the case of sit and refrain from action is different. In other words, the sages can uproot a Torah mitzvah by instructing one to sit and refrain from action, to remain passive and do nothing. They cannot, however, uproot a commandment, a Torah commandment, by telling someone to perform an action. Right? By rabbinic decree, sometimes it's going to come into conflict with Torah laws, and the rabbinic decree is going to trump the Torah law. But here the distinction is being made. It's only going to trump the Torah law when what we're saying is, the process is over. You can do no more. You're not allowed to go any further. But to go and actively do something that would seem like a violation of Torah law, rabbinic decree is not going to permit. Is different. So Rav Chisda said to Rabbah, I wanted to raise a difficulty against you from the law of an uncircumcised man. And the sages decreed that one who converts on the eve of Passover may not partake of the paschal lamb due to his ritual impurity. Somebody who converts on the afternoon before Passover, so he became a Jew. Now he should be obligated to eat the paschal lamb. But the problem is that he was just coming out of the world of being a non-Jew. And he probably has to wait a certain number of days until he becomes pure and immersed. And he's not going to be able to do that before, at least by rabbinic decree. He's not going to be able to do that before the time of eating the paschal lamb that night. And so by rabbinic decree, they're going to say, you cut it too close. You needed to convert, at least a full day or more before Passover came. Doing it on the afternoon before we eat the paschal lamb that night when the temple is standing, too late. right? So there we don't allow him to eat the Paschal lamb. And likewise, Rav Chisda said to Rabbah, I was also going to raise the question of a circumcision knife, which the sages decreed may not be carried on Shabbos, despite the fact that this entails the neglect of a Torah mitzvah, right? You can't carry the knife through the public domain, even to perform an 8th-day circumcision if it falls on Shabbos, because we don't want you carrying a knife through the public domain. That should have been done before Shabbos. You could have brought the knife to the place of the circumcision on Friday, and then you wouldn't have to do this. I think it was Rabbi Eliezer would permit this, but the sages disagree and say, no, you should have brought the knife to the place of circumcision before Shabbos. You can't bring it there on Shabbos. So we don't permit you to carry the knife, even though that has the effect of causing the circumcision to be delayed past the 8th day, which it's permitted to do an 8th-day circumcision on Shabbos, but in this situation, the sage is going to say no, because you didn't transport the knife there, so you can do it the next day on Sunday. And likewise, I wanted to mention a difficulty from the case of the lamb sacrificed on Shavuos. When the festival of Shavuos occurs on Shabbos, the sages rendered it prohibited to sprinkle the blood of its sacrificial lambs if the offerings had not been slaughtered with the proper intention, despite the fact that the sprinkling itself is not prohibited by Torah law. So in all these cases, a rabbinic decree is going to cause a positive Torah mitzvah by Torah law to not be done in its time, because the whatever the parameters were of the rabbinic decree, which said you should have handled this before, you didn't, so now you're not allowed to do it. But in all these cases, what the sages are saying is sit and do nothing. You're not going to be allowed to perform the positive mitzvah. They're not going to say go and do something, an action by rabbinic decree that seemingly violates a Torah law. So in all these cases, it's the difference between sit and do nothing and go and perform a positive action. Now the Gemara suggests, coming here another proof, the verse states with regard to a true prophet, to him you shall listen. So from here it is derived that even if the prophet says to you, transgress one of the commandments of the Torah. For example, in the case of Elijah. Elijah violated Torah law? Yes, he did. In the famous incident where, Ahab and Jezebel were killing all these prophets, right? And they weren't able to catch Elijah, but they were trying to bring idolatry and institutionalize it in Israel with their prophets of Baal and Ashtaroth. Like terrible sin. Somehow Elijah eluded them and was able to remain alive during this horrific period in Jewish history. And then a drought came, right? And the drought came in. Why was there a drought? Because Israel was following its king and queen and committing idolatry right and left. So finally, the drought got really bad. The people were starving. And then Elijah sent word, gather all your prophets, 400 prophets of these idolatrous gods, and let's meet at Mount Carmel in the north of Israel. They met there. And on that mountain, he said, well, let's see whose God is real. Put your whatever animal you're going to sacrifice, your cow, there, and dance to your God, and have your God, burn, cause the animal to burn and take the burnt offering. And their prophets danced and danced and danced and cut themselves and jumped up and down, etc. And of course, nothing happened. And then Elijah said, okay, soak my bull that he slaughtered. He slaughtered the bull properly, and then he had it soaked with water. Now, this was a drought. They were not only, dying of hunger, they were dying of thirst, right? It hadn't rained in so long. But they found enough water to soak the bull, which he said then he's going to ask God to command it to spontaneously combust, a miracle. They soaked it with water, and then he said, soak it again. I mean, Elijah was making a big performance, and they soaked it again, and then he prayed to God to show all these people who is the real God, and the cow caught fire by God's decree. A miracle was performed. on behalf of Elijah because he asked for it, and he demonstrated to the people that God is the real God. And then they got rid of all those prophets and their idols. And, for a while at least, Israel returned to proper behavior and worship of God. Now, great story, super dramatic. Why do you say that Elijah violated a Torah law when he did that? Why? Because the temple was standing at the time. And when the temple was standing, there was a decree that went along with it that offerings could only be brought on the altar in the temple, not outside the temple, not on Mount Carmel, which was a death penalty offense for bringing an offering in a place that is not the temple, not the place where God said, there my name shall be, and there you shall bring offerings. So let's go back to this story. So to a prophet, you listen. You say, to him you shall listen, Deuteronomy 18:15. And from here it is derived that even if the prophet says to you, transgress one of the commandments of the Torah, for example, as in the case of Elijah at Mount Carmel, who brought an offering to God on that mountain during a period when it was forbidden, on pain of Karas, to sacrifice offerings outside the temple, with regard to everything that he permits for the requirement of the hour. He didn't establish a precedent that now we can bring offerings outside the temple. It was necessary at that moment. In that situation, you must listen to him. You listen to the prophet. And this indicates that a Torah mitzvah can indeed be uprooted in an active manner. Now, can we say that sages can uproot a Torah law in an active manner because Elijah the prophet did? He was a prophet. And remember, it's not somebody who claims he's a prophet. It's a proven prophet, right? A proven prophet is one who says such and such will happen because God said so, and then it happens. Until then, he's not a proven prophet. So the Gemara answers, well, there it is different. As it is written, to him you shall listen, which means that it is a positive mitzvah to obey a prophet, and a positive mitzvah overrides a prohibition. He's not violating Torah law. He is a Torah law that you listen to a prophet. The prophet said, in that situation, I'm going to bring this offering. Doesn't mean it can be brought at other times and places. And the Gemara asks, and let him derive from this case a principle that the sages have the same power as a prophet. And the Gemara answers, safeguarding a matter is different. Since Elijah acted with the aim of preventing the Jewish people from worshiping idols, it was temporarily permitted for him to override a mitzvah in order to strengthen Torah observance with regard to a particular matter in which the people were lax. Doesn't mean you can do that and come and uproot Torah commandments by rabbinic decree unless there's like an incredibly compelling reason to do so. The Gemara cites, we're skipping forward a bit, we're near the bottom of page 90b. The Gemara cites yet another relevant source. Ooh, gotta move it. Come in here, as Rabbi Lazar ben Yaakov said, I have heard that the reason why the court may administer lashes and punish not by Torah law, i.e. in response to actions for which one is not liable to receive punishment by Torah law, but they can do it so that people will listen to rabbinic decrees, is not so as to transgress matters of Torah, but to establish a safeguard for the Torah. And an example of this is an incident involving a certain person who rode on a horse on Shabbos in the days of the Greeks, an act that is prohibited by rabbinic law, and they brought him to the court and they stoned him as a desecrator of Shabbos. And they did so not because he was deserving of this, as riding a horse is not punishable by stoning according to Torah law, but because the hour required it, as at that time Jews were negligent. There was like a big outflow of Jews away from Judaism and toward the secularism and idolatry of the Greek society, and they needed to be strong and stop people from doing that. And so in that case, they killed that Shabbos desecrator, even though stoning was not the appropriate punishment for that matter. We skip forward. On 91a, the Mishna further taught that the brothers of this one and the brothers of that one. So we're back to the case of this woman who remarried, either by the testimony of two witnesses or by the testimony of one. The Mishnah further taught that the brothers of this one and the brothers of that one all perform chalitza, and they do not consummate levirate marriage. So this is where she married on the testimony of one witness, and they're going to make her divorce both the second husband and the first husband. She's going to be prohibited to both of them. So in that situation, if she didn't have children by either one of them, they're going to make the brothers of each of those husbands perform chalitza with her, but yibum is not available. And the Gemara explains, the brother of the first husband performs chalitza by Torah law, as that woman is legally the wife of the first husband, and if they didn't have kids, and he died, so therefore it requires chalitza. I don't know why there's chalitza if he comes back, right? I guess maybe he comes back and then he dies. But he does not consummate levirate marriage by rabbinic law, as the sages penalized her and prohibited her from returning to her first husband. Conversely, the brother of the second one, if she marries the second one and he dies, the brother of the second one performs chalitza by rabbinic law, so that people do not say that a childless woman can leave her yavam without chalitza. But he does not consummate levirate marriage, neither by Torah law nor by rabbinic law, as her marriage to the second man was in error. It's pretty late. I'm going to skip forward. Okay, on page 91b, Ula raised an objection against Rav Shesh's reasoning. Do we say this justification? What could she have done? Right, we've been asking this all along. Come on. I mean, what should she have done? Let's say she waited for a long time. Let's say she waited for years. And there was only the testimony of the one witness. And then she said, okay, I want to get on with my life. And she married the second guy. And then this husband comes back, the first husband comes back from the dead. Can't we say, what could she have done? She tried hard. She did everything she could. Are we really going to penalize her this way? Is a woman considered, but shouldn't we consider that the woman acted under duress when she had no way to avoid the sin? But didn't we learn in a Mishna, if a man wrote a bill of divorce and dated it according to a kingdom that is not suitable, i.e. one that does not reign over their place of residence, or according to the kingdom of Media, or according to the kingdom of Greece, which are no longer in existence, or if he dated it according to the building of the temple, or according to the destruction of the temple. And similarly, if the bill of divorce was given in the east, and he wrote it in a place in the west, or in the west, and he wrote it in a place in the east, this bill of divorce is invalid. In other words, these are all technical reasons why a woman received a bill of divorce that was no good. It was an invalid bill of divorce. She thought it was valid. So then she remarried because she thought she was divorced. And then it turned out that the bill of divorce that she received was deficient, meaning she was still married to the first husband. And when she married the second husband, it was an illegitimate marriage. And if they had kids, it's a mamzer. And she had licentious sex, right? But what could she do? She thought it was a valid bill of divorce. And they're using this as an analogy. Likewise, when she relied on the testimony of one witness, she thought she was doing the right thing. Shouldn't we find an out for her? Consequently, if she married another man, she must leave this one and that one, both the one who gave her the bill of divorce and the new husband. And all these matters mentioned in the Mishnah here, the penalties imposed on a married woman who remarried unlawfully, apply to her. And the Gemara asks, but why? Let us say, what could she have done? She acted under duress as she married again only because she thought the bill of divorce was valid. And the Gemara answers, this woman did not act under duress, as she should have had the bill of divorce read by a scholar who would have told her that it was invalid. And they give a whole bunch more examples of the same thing. Bottom line, when you sign a contract, either read it and understand it, or get someone who reads it and understands it to okay it for you. Particularly if you're ever, a Jew who's divorced and remarrying, so show the get to the rabbi. He should require that he sees it before he marries you to the second spouse to make sure that the bill of divorce was valid so that the second marriage is valid. And if you don't get the bill of divorce read and checked, it's on you. That's what the sages are saying. It's just getting really late, so I'm going to skip that. Okay, and the last thing I'm going to do is on page 92, I'm going to read the Mishnah that's printed there. So Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 10. With regard, and then we'll take a few questions. With regard to a woman whose husband and child went overseas, and witnesses came and said to her, your husband died, and afterward your child died. So she does not require levirate marriage, as at the time when she became a widow, when her husband died, he had a child. And so he left a child. There's no yibum requirement. She does not require yibum, as she had a child when her husband died. And for this reason, she went and married another man. But afterward, they said to her that the matters were reversed. New witnesses came and they said, well, actually, the child died before the husband, which means that she did require levirate marriage. And she is therefore a Yevama who married a stranger without first getting chalitza with her brother-in-law. Means that her marriage to the second husband, who's outside the family, had nothing to do with the first husband, was illegitimate because she was still held in the levirate bond to her brother-in-law until she got chalitza from him. And that was therefore an illegitimate marriage. So she is therefore a Yevama who married a stranger without chalitza, and she must consequently leave her second husband. And with regard to the first child, the one born before they heard about the reversal, and the last one, the one who was born after they realized who actually died first, each of these children is a mamzer. Conversely, if they said to her, your child died, and afterward your husband died, and so she therefore entered into yibum with her brother-in-law, and afterward they said to her, no, actually the matters were reversed, which means she married her husband's brother when there was no obligation in yibum, and therefore her brother-in-law was prohibited to her, so then she must leave that second husband, and the first child and the last one are each a mamzer. If they said to her, your husband died, and she married, and afterward they said to her that he was alive at the time of her marriage, and he later died, she must leave the second husband. And the first child, born when her original husband was still alive, is a mamzer, and the last one, born after his death, is not a mamzer. And if they said to her, your husband died, and she became betrothed to another man, and afterward her husband came, so she is permitted to return to him, as betrothal alone does not render her forbidden to her husband. She didn't have sex with the second husband. Furthermore, although the last man, i.e. her betrothed, gave her a bill of divorce, he has not thereby disqualified her from marrying into the priesthood. She was never his wife, for the betrothal was invalid, and the bill of divorce given to the wife of another man, which we need as a formality, but she doesn't make her a divorcee, and that's why she remains qualified to marry a priest if she, say, becomes a widow again, like when the first husband that she returns to actually dies and she becomes a widow. She can't marry the high priest, but she could marry a priest because that in-between bill of divorce that she received from that second husband doesn't render her a divorcee. And this was taught by Rabbi Elazar ben Matya. The verse states with regard to priests, neither shall they take a woman divorced from her husband, which indicates, and not one who was divorced from a man who is not her husband. For example, the second man in our case. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let's just take a couple of questions. From Michelle, would the first husband have the option of being able to petition the court for an appeal if he wanted to remain married to his wife? I mean, it seems like in this case, no, right? No, she's going to become prohibited to him because the problem is, in a Jewish marriage, if a woman has sex with a man who's not her husband, then even if he forgives her, she becomes prohibited to him and they cannot remain married. So I'm not sure if the appeal would work. I think what they would seek to do, and we haven't even discussed it here, like they would probably try to find some kind of justification for a nullification that would allow her to somehow remain with the first husband. But according to the law, as it's been presented in our Gemaras today, and where the halacha actually came out, no, she's not going to be able to go back to her first husband. Paula, what priest would sprinkle an impure offering? Has there ever been such a horrible thing done on purpose? I don't think he would ever do it like because he was sneaky and wanted to render the blood he made a mistake and be embarrassed in front of the other priests. Maybe that's a situation where human nature could lead to it happening, and we pray that it would not, right? And that's where we really count on the priests. Not only do we hold them to a very high standard of purity, of separation from everyone else, and to the highest moral standards, but we hope that they hold themselves to the highest moral standards, right? And, I saw the related when we were counting the Omer before Shavuos, right? So every night you count, that day's count, and you do it with a bracha, with a blessing. Blessed you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who sanctifies us with his commandments, and commands us to count the Omer, and then we count that night. Now, if the one who is acting as Chazan, the prayer leader, he's usually the one that counts with the bracha in front of the room, and then he does the count, the official count, and then we all in our seats say the blessing, and then we do the count. If you skipped a day, so then you can keep counting after that, but you can no longer do it with the blessing, right? You missed the count, so you invalidated it from then on. You can keep counting, but not with a blessing. You're not fulfilling the commandment of counting the days between the second day of Passover and Shavuos. So, there was just a guy in Armenian who was leading the prayers that night, and then somebody said to him, don't forget to count the Omer in front, in front of the room for everybody. And he said, I can't do it with the bracha, right? It meant that he skipped a night at some point. Now, it was embarrassing to him to admit that in front of the room, but it was the proper thing to do because, otherwise it would have been like a lie and it would have been desecrating God's name and making a blessing in vain. He did the right thing by admitting what he had done. And that was, a menschy thing to do and a little bit similar to the priest who has to admit that he messed up. And finally, Sharon, in keeping with these to do or not to do, one of my students asked this: in temple times, how did the people perform the ritual of the first fruits in the Shemitah years? Right? So in the years where we're not allowed to harvest, how did they bring first fruits? It's a great question. I don't know. Maybe they didn't bring Bikurim in the Shemitah year. I'd have to look it up. I just don't know. Okay, my friends, that's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be back to normal tomorrow and just do one daf at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, Wednesday night. Have a